The last major theme relating to federalism in Chapter 3 of your text has to do with the idea of change. How have the powers and relationship between the federal government and the states changed over time? And what does that mean for how the United States is governed? These are the questions that this video lecture will address. A balancing act between the federal government and the states has been going on since the Constitution was ratified. It's something of a continuous struggle as each level of government responds to societal changes and shifts in political philosophy. While there's always been something of a tug of war, it's possible to look at large-scale trends and identify different eras of American history in which the federal system worked somewhat differently in each era. For simplicity's sake, I'm going to break down the history of federalism in the United States into three eras. The first era is generally referred to as dual federalism, and it generally characterized the relationship between the federal government and the states from the ratification of the Constitution until the 1930s. This era is often described with the metaphor of a layer cake, because during this time the activities of the federal government and the states were mostly separate and distinct from one another. The national government was primarily concerned with things like national defense and foreign affairs, settlement of the Western territories, and development of national transportation and communications infrastructure, things like the railroad, postal service, telegraph, and interstate waterways. The states had more or less sole authority over the types of government activities that had a more direct day-to-day impact on Americans' lives, things like education, running a justice system, providing for public safety, and creating rules for the operation of businesses within state lines. Since the two levels of government mostly focused on different activities, the national government and the states operated mostly independently of one another. Also, during this time, the scope of federal government activities were generally limited fairly closely to the enumerated powers spelled out in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. However, even during this period of separate activity and relatively limited powers exercised by the federal government, there were some important precursors that would set the stage for later expansion of the federal government. The first is the case of McCulloch versus Maryland, which we discussed earlier as a key affirmation of the National Supremacy Clause, as well as the Necessary and Proper Clause. Please make sure you're familiar with this case. The second precursor is the case of Gibbons versus Ogden. This case involved competing steamboat operators on an interstate waterway, the Hudson River. One operator had received an exclusive license to operate by the state of New York. The other operator received a license from Congress. The Supreme Court ruled that Congress issuing a license was an appropriate use of its power to regulate interstate commerce, and therefore the federal license superseded New York's attempt to establish a monopoly for the other steamboat operator. This ruling was important because it established the principle that interstate commerce was more than just the movement of goods across state lines, but also included other types of commercial activity that had an interstate component. The system of dual federalism, in which the activities of the states and the federal government were largely distinct, gradually started to give way to a different dynamic, in which the national government became a much more dominant player in the federal system. As time proceeds from the late 19th century into the early 20th century, the United States experiences massive changes that reshape society. As the American economy is transformed by the Industrial Revolution, new challenges arise that the states are unable to respond to effectively. More and more demands are made for the federal government to play a greater role in addressing some of the social upheaval caused by this new industrial economy. Some early indicators of the decline of dual federalism occurred during the administration of Teddy Roosevelt. It's during this time that the Sherman Antitrust Act is passed into law, giving the federal government the power to break up railroad and oil monopolies, an aggressive application of the Interstate Commerce Clause. Roosevelt also intervened in a coal miners' strike, giving the first federal recognition of labor's right to organize. It's also during this time that we see the first national food safety regulations. But those early shifts toward greater federal power in the economy were relatively small compared to what would come during the Great Depression, as the economy was plunged into deep turmoil with massive unemployment and rampant bank failures, Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal programs were intended to lift the economy out of depression. These programs represented a huge increase in the role of the federal government in managing the national economy. Social Security, a standardized work week, child labor laws, union laws, occupational safety, bank regulation, minimum wage, housing programs, public works and job training programs, Wall Street regulations. These were all dramatic new steps taken by the federal government to manage the economy in such a way that the events of the Great Depression would not repeat themselves. These programs were primarily based on a broad interpretation of the Interstate Commerce Clause, which generally argued an era of big business had created a single national economy which required regulation by the national government. The New Deal programs did represent something of a power grab by the federal government, as the states had been caught flat-footed by the Depression. However, over time, the dynamic began to shift from the nation-centered federalism that characterized the New Deal to something more like a cooperative scheme that exists today. This is sometimes called marble cake federalism because it involves the mixing or intermingling of activities between the federal government and the states in most policy areas. This is partly the result of decisions made by the federal government about how to design certain programs. Rather than hiring tons and tons of new federal workers to carry out federal policy goals, what happened instead was that the federal government utilized its spending power to send money to state governments for them to increase their capacity to carry out programs for the public good. Grants and aid are a major tool used by the federal government to try to achieve its policy goals. These grants and aid are federal money made available to the states to carry out government programs. Oftentimes, this money is used for specific purposes. In education, for example, the federal government makes funds available to the states for Head Start and school lunch programs. In healthcare, Medicaid is a program run on a state-by-state basis in which the federal government grants money to the states to help them fund most of the costs of running that program. As a condition of receiving grant money from the federal government, states are often required to meet mandates or certain minimum standards. A couple of examples in the area of transportation include the requirements that states adopt a legal drinking age of 21 rather than 18, and that they establish a .08 blood alcohol level as the threshold for determining driving under the influence in order for states to receive their full share of transportation program grants. While states sometimes complain about the conditions that the federal government places on the grant money it makes available to states, the states generally have a hard time saying no to the money. Grants and aid have become a hugely important component of government activity at all levels. In 2016, the federal government provided $661 billion in grants to the states and local governments, a tenfold increase over half a century. That grant money represents 1/4 of all spending by state and local governments. That's hugely important. That's money which helps pay the salaries of millions of teachers, police officers, and public health and safety officials employed by state and local government agencies throughout the country. It's also hugely important to the federal government, representing 17% of its total spending. Without state and local governments capable of carrying out programs created at the national level, the federal government would have a much harder time achieving its policy goals. So we have a system today in which the different levels of government are highly interdependent upon one another and need to work together in order to serve the public.